Coat's not warm enough. Celeste didn't answer. She kept her eyes on the frozen road unspooling ahead of them, watching the tree line swallow the last pale smear of late afternoon light. The truck smelled of diesel and old coffee, and the man sitting beside her smelled of neither, just pine resin, and something colder, like river water in November. She had known Remy Bouchard for 11 days before she married him. She had known her landlord for 3 years before he changed the locks while she was at work. The math was simple. Her father had introduced them at the feed store in Saint Félicien. Remy had come in for wire fencing and a box of 12-gauge shells. He was not an ugly man, but he was not a gentle one either. He shook her hand the way men shake hands with other men. Firm, brief, no performance. He looked at her the way a person looks at weather. Assessing, not unkind, just honest about what he saw. He asked her father 3 days later if she was still looking for a place to land. She was 23 years old. She had $47 in a chipped ceramic mug on a shelf that was no longer hers, a duffel bag of clothes, and a waitressing job at a diner that was closing in 2 weeks because the owner's son had driven it into the ground, gambling on hockey games. She said yes. The ceremony was at the township office, 9 in the morning, 2 witnesses who worked the front desk and seemed mildly inconvenienced by the whole thing. Remy wore the same canvas jacket he'd worn to the feed store. Céleste wore a blue wool dress that had been her mother's and still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets her mother kept in every drawer of every dresser she'd ever owned. It was the most expensive thing Céleste had ever put on her body, and it was 30 years old. Remy didn't comment on it. He signed the papers with a ballpoint pen that ran dry halfway through his signature, and he swore quietly under his breath and pressed harder until the ink came back. They drove north out of Saint Félicien in his truck. He had not told her exactly how far north. She had not asked. It hadn't seemed like the right moment for questions. And now, 2 hours into the drive, the questions had multiplied into something too large and shapeless to voice. "Coat's not warm enough," he said again. "I know." She pulled it tighter anyway. It was a fall coat, not a winter coat. She hadn't had a winter coat for 2 years. She'd been wearing 2 sweaters under the fall one and telling herself it was fine. "I'll manage." Remy reached behind the seat without looking, the way a man reaches for something he's reached for 1,000 times in the dark. He dropped a heavy flannel-lined work jacket across her lap. It was enormous. It smelled like him, and like sawdust, and under both of those, like something metallic she couldn't name. She put it on. It hung past her thighs. The sleeve swallowed her hands completely. She felt faintly ridiculous and also infuriatingly warmer. She stared out the window and said nothing. The highway gave way to a regional road, which gave way to a logging road, which gave way to something that was technically a road only because a truck had driven it often enough to leave 2 parallel channels in the dirt and gravel. The forest pressed in close on both sides, black spruce and tamarack, so dense the headlights barely reached the tree trunks before the darkness swallowed them. Céleste's stomach gave a slow, deliberate roll of unease. She thought about the ceramic mug on the shelf that wasn't hers anymore. She thought about her mother's lavender sachets. She thought about how $47 was not enough to get anywhere useful if useful turned out to be necessary. "How much farther?" she asked. 20 minutes. He paused. "If we don't get stuck, are we likely to get stuck?" He considered this with more seriousness than she would have liked. There was rain last week, ground soft under the snow. They got stuck 40 minutes later. The back wheel sank into a patch of mud hidden under a thin crust of frozen slush, spinning uselessly while the truck lurched and settled. Remy killed the engine. He sat for a moment looking through the windshield at the dark tree wall in front of them. Then he got out without saying anything. Céleste got out too, because sitting in the truck alone in the dark felt worse than whatever was happening outside it. The cold was a different animal out here than it had been in Saint Félicien. In town, cold was inconvenient. Here, it had weight and intention. It pressed against her face and found the gap at her collar, and worked its way into her ears within 30 seconds. The mud sucked at her boots when she stepped off the tire track. One boot sank nearly to the ankle. Remy had pulled a length of chain from the truck bed and was wrapping it around something under the rear axle with the focused efficiency of a man who had done this before, probably many times, probably alone. "Can I help?" Céleste said. "Grab the handle of that come-along and hold it steady." She had no idea what a come-along was. She looked at the truck bed. There was a device with a hook and a ratchet handle, and she picked it up and held it steady, and apparently that was the right choice, because Remy took it from her a moment later without commentary and used it to anchor the chain to a spruce tree. It took 40 minutes and significant mechanical leverage to free the truck. By the time they got back in the cab, Céleste's fingers had gone past cold into the specific, numb uselessness that meant she couldn't have unbuttoned a button to save her life. She tucked her hands under her thighs and breathed through her teeth. Remy glanced over at her. He turned the heat dial all the way to the right. He didn't say anything. He drove. The truck emerged from the tree line onto something that opened up. A wide clearing, the sky suddenly enormous and salt white with stars above a cap of pewter cloud. A frozen lake stretched to the left, catching the moonlight in long blue-silver stripes. The road curved around it, climbed a low ridge, and Remy pulled up in front of what appeared in the headlights to be a wall of dark timber. A cabin. Obviously a cabin. Céleste looked at it and felt the hollow in her stomach fill in with a kind of leaden finality. It was small, smaller than her apartment had been, and her apartment had been described, generously, by the landlord as cozy. One window on the front wall, a rusted metal pipe for a chimney. A woodpile to the right that was, at least, impressively large. She got out of the truck. She stood in the snow and looked at the cabin and consciously, deliberately, did not let her face do anything. Remy unloaded her duffel bag from the truck bed and set it by the door. He unlocked a padlock the size of her fist and pushed the door inward. The hinges groaned. The smell that came out was cold ash and old spruce, and something underneath those, ancient and close, like the smell of a place that has been shut up for a season. A single lantern. A wood stove. A table with 2 chairs. A narrow bed along the far wall. Shelves. Hooks. The complete, unambiguous vocabulary of poverty arranged in a 12 by 16-foot room. Remy set a fire in the wood stove with unsettling competence. 3 sheets of newspaper, 2 pieces of birch bark, 4 sticks of kindling, 2 splits of wood, and a single match. Like an equation. Like he'd solved this problem so many times it had stopped being a problem. He handed her a tin cup of water from the jug on the shelf. "Woodhouse is 20 feet behind the cabin," he said. "There's a path. Don't go off it in the dark." "Right," she said. "Bedding's in the trunk at the foot of the bed. Extra wool socks on the second shelf. Your feet look cold." Her feet were cold. She had stopped feeling her toes somewhere around the time they'd been pulling the truck out of the mud. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off her boots and her damp socks, and found the wool ones on the second shelf, exactly where he'd said they would be. They were enormous. Men's socks. She put them on anyway. Remy heated soup on the wood stove, canned, from the shelf above the table, tomato with bits of pasta. He poured it into 2 bowls and set one in front of her and ate his standing at the counter, looking at the wall. Céleste ate, sitting down. She ate faster than she meant to. The soup was too hot, and she burned her tongue and didn't stop. When the bowl was empty, she sat with her hands wrapped around the warmth of it, and listened to the fire knock and settle in the stove, and thought, "This is the rest of my life. This is the room and the man and the outhouse path in the dark and the soup from a can. This is what surviving looks like." She had survived before. She would survive this. What she had not counted on was Remy Bouchard. He was not a cruel man, though she'd braced for cruelty the way you brace for a punch you've been told is coming. He was not a warm man either. Not in any way she'd been taught to recognize warmth. He did not ask her how she was doing. He did not fill the silence with reassurances. He did not tell her things would be all right. What he did was bring in firewood before she noticed it was getting low. Leave a pair of insulated work gloves on the table without comment when he saw her wearing the flannel-lined jacket to do the dishes. Show her once, without being asked, which direction to go if she followed the creek bed in case she ever needed to reach the road on foot. That last thing stayed with her. He'd shown her the way out, unprompted, like he wanted her to know she had it. A week passed. She learned the shape of the days, the silence before he left in the morning, the particular quality of the cold, depending on cloud cover, the way the wood stove sounded different when the wind came from the northwest. She swept. She organized the shelf. She found a box of paperback novels behind the woodpile and read 3 of them in 2 days, and felt no guilt about it whatsoever. On the 8th day, she asked him where he went. He'd come back at dusk as always, smelling of cold air and something she'd started trying to identify. Not sawdust exactly, not metal, something mineral, something that came from underground. Work, he said. You said that before. What kind of work? He poured himself coffee. He stood at the stove with his back to her for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Come tomorrow, he said finally. I'll show you. She almost said no. Something in the flatness of the invitation felt like a test, and she was tired of being tested by this country and this winter and this life. But she said yes, because she was more curious than she was tired, and because she'd read all 3 paperbacks. He woke her before dawn. They walked. She hadn't understood there was anything to walk to. She'd assumed the work was in the other direction, toward the road, toward civilization. Instead, they went deeper into the trees, following a path she hadn't seen, up the long slope of the ridge she'd noticed from the lake. Remy walked ahead. He didn't help her over the rough ground. He set a pace and held it, and trusted her to keep up. She kept up. The cold was brutal at that hour, the stars still visible through the canopy. She could feel her breath as a physical thing, a cloud she had to walk through every few steps. Her thighs burned on the slope. She didn't say anything. They crested the ridge, and Remy stopped. Céleste came up beside him and looked down into the valley on the other side. She'd been expecting another cabin, maybe a tool shed, maybe some kind of commercial trapline operation. She didn't really know how those worked, but it seemed plausible. She had not been expecting a property boundary fence of black wrought iron 8 feet high, anchored in stone pillars at regular intervals, and running the entire perimeter of a clearing that held a house. And she used the word house the way you'd use it for something that had outgrown the word without finding a better one. It was built of field stone and heavy timber, 3 full stories, with a metal roof the color of old pewter, and a covered porch running the entire south face. Every window was dark, but they were large, double-paned, and expensive. A generator shed sat off the east side, connected by a covered walkway. A separate building, large enough to be a workshop, large enough to be a garage with room for several vehicles, stood to the north. Chimney at the center, cold, no smoke. Nobody home? Céleste stood in the snow on the ridge and looked at it for a long time. "Whose is that?" she said. Remy's answer was the same as his answer to most things, quiet, flat, direct. "Mine." The word landed in her chest like a stone dropped in still water. She stood there. She replayed the cabin, the outhouse in the dark, the canned tomato soup, the 2 chairs and the single lantern and the men's wool socks on the second shelf. She replayed 11 days of making herself small in a 12 by 16-foot room, telling herself this is what surviving looks like, telling herself she'd survived before. She turned and looked at him. He was watching her, not defensively, not with guilt exactly, more the way a man watches whether he's been waiting for. "You have a house," she said. Her voice came out very even. She was proud of that. "Yes." "You have a house, and you brought me to a cabin." "Yes." The even voice lasted approximately 3 more seconds. Then something she'd been keeping carefully compressed since the day her landlord changed the locks, and the diner posted its closing notice in the window, and her father looked at her across the kitchen table with that helpless, apologetic expression. Something gave way. Not grief, not sadness. Anger, clean and hot and entirely clarifying. Why? The word came out hard. Why would you do that? Why would you let me spend a week in that box? Thinking that was it, thinking that was what I'd. Why didn't you just tell me? Remy didn't move. He absorbed the question the way the stone pillars below absorbed the cold, completely, without visible effect. Because I needed to see something, he said. You needed to see something. She stared at him. What did you need to see? Whether I'd complain, whether I'd fall apart, whether I was too delicate for. Whether you'd work, he said. It wasn't an interruption exactly, more like a clarification he'd been waiting for the right moment to offer. Whether you'd organize the shelf and read the books and figure out the wood stove damper by yourself on the third day and not ask me to fix things you could fix yourself. She opened her mouth and closed it again. He looked at the house below. I was married before. Brought her up here in a truck that had heat and a cab that didn't leak. Put her in the house with the good dishes and the proper bed. She was gone by April. Took the truck and 6 months of supplies and left a note on the kitchen table. The note said I was a difficult man to love. He was quiet for a moment. She was right. I am. But what she meant was that the isolation wasn't what she'd expected, and what she'd expected was that being comfortable would make it easier, and it didn't. Céleste looked at the side of his face. The scar along his jaw she'd been wondering about, the deep lines around his eyes that weren't from squinting in sunlight. So you thought if you showed me the worst first, she said slowly. I thought if the worst was enough to break you, the best wouldn't save you. He looked at her. And if the worst wasn't enough to break you, you deserved to know there was a best. She held his gaze. The anger was still there. She didn't pretend it wasn't, and she didn't perform any quick forgiveness for his benefit. She had spent a week being cold and uncertain and swallowing questions in a 12 by 16-foot room. That was real. She wasn't going to patch it over because the explanation had internal logic. But she understood it. She stood there in the blue cold dawn, understanding it completely and hating that she did. You could have told me, she said finally. You could have trusted me with the information. You could have left the morning you arrived, he said. You didn't. I had $47 and nowhere to go. You had the truck keys on the hook by the door. He held her gaze. You've walked past them every day for a week. She had. She'd noticed them on day 2. She had thought, insurance. She had thought, if I need to, I can. And then she'd made soup and read her paperback and not needed to. She thought about that now. Remy reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a key. Not a truck key. A proper house key, new brass, on a simple ring with no other keys attached. He held it out to her. She looked at it for a moment before she took it. Front door, he said. It's the only copy I've had made. She turned it over in her fingers. The brass was cold and sharp at the edges. She closed her hand around it. I want a bathtub, she said. A real one, not a basin. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. She'd stopped expecting those, but something adjacent to it. A softening. The way granite softens when the light hits it right. Cast iron, built in, clawfoot. He started down the slope toward the gate. The hot water runs off the outdoor wood boiler. It takes 40 minutes to heat if you want a full tub. She followed him down the ridge, the key pressed into her palm. The house was cold inside. It had been shut for weeks, but it was not empty. The main room was broad and low-ceilinged, with exposed timber beams and a fireplace large enough to stand in. The kitchen was proper. A gas range, a deep farmhouse sink, shelves that actually held enough dishes for more than 2 people, eating soup from cans. A library wall in the hallway. The shelves built into the stone. hundreds of books with cracked spines, a workshop in the basement, lit by a long row of fluorescent lights above a workbench scarred with a decade of use. She stood in the library hallway and ran her fingers along the book spines. "You read," she said. It came out faintly accusatory. "Most nights," he said, from somewhere behind her. "You have 300 books." 342, I counted. She pulled one from the shelf. It fell open at a cracked page, read many times. She turned it over to look at the cover. A history of the fur trade. She put it back. They slept at the house that night, in a room that had a proper bed and a window that faced east and filled with gray morning light before the alarm went off. Céleste lay awake for a while after Remy's breathing steadied and looked at the ceiling beams. She thought about the $47. She thought about the truck keys on the hook she hadn't taken. She thought about the key in the pocket of the flannel-lined jacket, which she was now wearing to sleep in because old habits of cold don't vanish in a night. She was still angry with him. She thought she might be angry with him for quite a long time. She was also, underneath the anger, something else, something she didn't have a clean word for. Not safe. Safe was too soft for what this was. Something more like recognized. The way you feel when someone sees the particular thing you actually are and responds to it directly, without gloss, without flattery, without pretending it's easier than it is. She pulled the jacket closer. She slept. The weeks shaped themselves into a different rhythm. Remy worked the property. She understood now that there was extensive land, a woodlot operation, a lease arrangement for the mineral rights on the North Ridge. They required quarterly documentation. She helped him organize because his handwriting was catastrophic, and he admitted this without embarrassment. She cooked more than she needed to, and he ate everything without comment, which she decided was its own form of compliment. She found the snowshoes in the equipment shed and taught herself to use them by going out alone on the lake in the afternoons, and falling down a lot and getting back up. He watched her from the workshop window once. She knew because she could see the shape of him behind the glass. She didn't fall down any more after that. Not because he was watching, but because she'd figured it out. On a Sunday in late February, the temperature dropped to something that felt geological, like weather as geology, cold as a feature of the landscape rather than a condition of the air. Remy built a fire in the main room fireplace, the big one, not just the wood stove. He brought out a bottle of rye whiskey from the back of the highest kitchen shelf and poured 2 glasses over ice he'd chipped from the block in the cold room. He set one on the table beside her chair without asking. She picked it up and drank and let it burn. "I'm still angry with you," she said, because it seemed important to say. "I know," he said. "The cabin wasn't fair." "No," he agreed. She looked at him across the fire. He was looking into it. The light found things in his face that the flat winter daylight didn't. Something worn through to something underneath. Not softness. Something more durable than softness. "The key," she said. "You only had one made." "Yes." "You gave it to me the same day I found out about the house." "Yes." "You weren't planning to keep me here regardless." "No." He looked at her. "I told you. I needed to see whether you'd work. Once I'd seen it, the rest was your decision." She turned the glass in her fingers. The fire popped and sent up a brief orange plume. "And if I'd decided to leave," she said, "that day on the ridge or after, what then?" Remy was quiet for long enough that she thought, again, that he might not answer. Then you'd have left. I'd have driven you back to Saint Félicien and given you the annulment paperwork myself." He paused. "And I'd have stayed here with 342 books and nobody to tell me the handwriting was catastrophic." Céleste looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the ceramic mug on a shelf that wasn't hers anymore. She thought about the landlord and the diner and the blue wool dress and the $47. She thought about everything she'd walked away from and everything she walked into, and the considerable distance between what she'd expected and what she'd found. She thought about the snowshoes and the lake and the library in the hall, and the key in the pocket of the jacket she now thought of, quietly and without saying so, as her jacket. You need someone to organize the mineral rights paperwork anyway, she said. Remy looked at her. That thing happened to his face again, the granite and the light. The quarterly filing is in March, he said. I know. I found the folder. She took a slow sip of whiskey. Your system is incomprehensible. I know, he said. It's always been incomprehensible. Nobody's ever told me before. Nobody's been here before, not who stayed. The fire burned. The cold pressed at the window glass, and the house held, the way it had been built to hold, the stone and the timber, and the years of it, solid against everything outside. Céleste tucked her feet under her on the chair and turned back to her book and felt Remy, across from her, do the same. She didn't tell him she'd decided to stay. She didn't think she needed to. The key was in her pocket. The truck keys were on the hook by the door. She hadn't touched either one. That was its own kind of answer, not a declaration, not a ceremony, not a promise made in words. Just a woman who'd walked past the door every day and chosen, each time, to stay. That was what it looked like when survival became something else. Not romantic and not simple, but hers, entirely uncomplicatedly hers. Outside, the February cold did what it always did. It held everything still and bright and honest, the way extreme cold always does, stripping the landscape down to what actually endures. Inside, the fire kept burning. I keep thinking about those truck keys on the hook by the door. Céleste walked past them every single day. She knew they were there. She knew what they meant. And she chose, each morning, to put on her boots and do the dishes and figure out the damper on the wood stove by herself instead. That detail stays with me more than any of the dramatic moments in this story. More than the mud on the logging road, more than the iron gate appearing out of the snow. It's such a quiet thing, a set of keys on a hook. And yet it's where everything true about her character lived. What happened to Céleste wasn't random, and it wasn't luck. There's a cause and effect running through this story that I think is worth sitting with. She ended up somewhere real and solid, not because the world finally went easy on her, but because she showed up honestly to every hard thing it handed her. She didn't perform toughness. She didn't make demands she hadn't earned. She organized the shelf. She taught herself the snowshoes. She fell down on the lake and got back up when nobody was watching. That accumulation of small, unwitnessed choices, that's what Remy actually saw. And that's what changed everything. I think about integrity a lot when I think about this story. Not integrity as a word people put in resumes, but the real thing, being the same person when no one is looking as you are, when someone is. Céleste didn't know Remy was watching from the workshop window. She got back up anyway. She didn't know the keys were a test. She left them on the hook because leaving felt wrong, not because she was trying to pass anything. That's the only version of integrity that actually holds up, the kind that doesn't know it's being measured. And then there's the matter of understanding, real understanding, the kind that requires you to set your own feelings aside long enough to actually think. Céleste was angry with Remy. She had every right to be. But she didn't let the anger be the whole story. She stood on that ridge and turned his explanation over in her mind, and found that it had internal logic, even while it had caused her genuine pain, holding both of those things at once. This hurt me, and I understand why you did it. That takes a kind of clear-eyed intelligence that most people spend their whole lives avoiding because it's so much easier to just stay angry. And the sheer staying power of her. $47 and nowhere to go, yes. But she'd had nowhere to go before, and she'd survived that too. Is a kind of person who meets difficulty and finds the bottom of it and keeps going anyway. Not because they're fearless, but because stopping has started to feel less survivable than forward. Céleste was that kind of person. She didn't discover it in the wilderness. She brought it with her. Remy recognized all three of those things in her before she recognized them in herself. That's why he gave her the only key he'd made, not as a gesture, as a statement of fact. You've already shown me who you are. The rest is yours to decide. I think that's the story, really. Not the hidden estate, not the reveal on the ridge, the keys on the hook that she never took, the person she already was, finally somewhere that could see it.